Burn it. Walker didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He picked up Specialist Claire Bennett's personnel file, her 5 years of service, her qualification scores, her documented kills, and he dropped it directly into the metal trash can beside his desk. Then he lit a match. "I will not send my men into combat behind something that small," he said, watching the paper curl and blacken. "Whatever Washington thinks they're doing, this ends here." The fire ate her record alive. Every score, every mission, every proof she had ever existed as a soldier. Gone. That was the moment Claire Bennett stopped trying to earn their respect and started planning to save their lives anyway. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Drop your city in the comments below. Tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The transport helicopter touched down at exactly 0600 hours at the remote training compound outside of Tucson, Arizona, and the dust it kicked up swirled across the tarmac in thick brown curtains that smelled like heat and dry earth, and something ancient that the desert never quite let go of. Specialist Claire Bennett stepped off that helicopter with her Barrett M-Raid precision sniper rifle strapped across her back, her boots hitting the ground with a sound that nobody noticed because nobody was paying attention to her yet. She carried a standard-issue tactical pack. She wore the same uniform as every other soldier assigned to temporary duty with Naval Special Warfare Development Group, the unit the world knew as SEAL Team 6. She had the same patches, the same rank, the same exhausted look of someone who had just survived a 14-hour flight from a base that wasn't supposed to exist on any publicly available map. But none of that mattered to the men who saw her walk across that tarmac. What they saw was her size, 4 feet 9 inches, 27 years old. A woman who, in the words of Senior Chief Petty Officer Raymond Bull Kowalski, looked like she belonged behind a school desk rather than behind a trigger. Kowalski was the first one to say it out loud. "I was standing near the fuel depot with 3 other SEAL operators, Petty Officer First Class Derek Miller, Petty Officer Second Class Anthony Reyes, and Chief Petty Officer Marcus Webb. And when he saw Claire come off that helicopter, he stopped mid-sentence in whatever story he was telling and just stared. Then he elbowed Miller in the ribs. 'You seeing what I'm seeing?' Kowalski asked. Miller turned, looked, blinked. 'Is that our new Overwatch?' Miller said. 'Can't be. That's what the manifest says.' Kowalski shook his head slowly, the way a man does when he's genuinely baffled, when something in the world refuses to make sense. 'That little girl is supposed to be our sniper support.' Webb crossed his arms. He was the quietest of the 4, the most experienced, the one who had been in places that would rearrange a person's understanding of human suffering. He watched Claire walk across the tarmac and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, 'She's going to get somebody killed.' Nobody disagreed. Claire walked past them without looking in their direction. She had heard every word. She had excellent hearing. Years of training on long-range acoustics as part of sniper qualification learning to read sound at distance, to filter noise, to isolate what mattered from what didn't, had given her ears that caught things most people missed. She could hear a muffled conversation through a wall. She could identify a whisper at 50 feet. She heard Kowalski. She heard Miller. She heard Webb. She kept walking. Because she had also learned something that most people don't figure out until it's too late. The moment you stop to argue with someone who doesn't believe in you, you've already started losing. The battlefield would answer their questions. Not her words, not her resume, not her record, which was sitting in a file folder on Lieutenant Walker's desk, with numbers that should have ended the conversation before it started. But first she had to survive the briefing room. Lieutenant Jason Walker was 38 years old, a decorated combat veteran with 4 deployments to the Middle East, 2 Silver Stars, and a reputation within naval special warfare as one of the most tactically aggressive commanders currently active. He was 6'2", built like something that was welded together rather than born, and he had a way of looking at people that made them feel like they were being X-rayed. When Claire knocked on the frame of his open office door, he was studying topographic maps of a desert region that was marked on the folder cover only with a set of coordinates. He looked up. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back down at the map. "Bennett," he said, not a question. "Yes, sir." "Shut the door." She shut it. "Sit down." She sat. Walker picked up a folder from the corner of his desk, opened it, and spent approximately 90 seconds reading through it without speaking. Claire sat straight in the chair, hands on her knees, and waited. She was good at waiting. Patience was one of the first things real sniper training burned into you, the ability to hold completely still, to make your body into something that the world forgot was there to exist in silence for as long as the mission required. Walker set the folder down. Your qualification scores, he said. Yes, sir. 840 meters, wind-adjusted first round hit. Sustained. That's your documented max effective range from Fort Benning. Yes, sir. And then there's this annotation here. He tapped a line near the bottom of the page. An unofficial range record from a training exercise in the Nevada desert. 1,400 meters, not in ideal conditions. It was dusty, Claire said. Some wind. Walker stared at her. 1,400 meters in bad conditions is not something that happens often, Specialist. No, sir. It doesn't happen by accident. No, sir. Walker leaned back in his chair and studied her the way he studied maps, looking for terrain features, looking for weaknesses, looking for places where things could go wrong. You're going to have a problem on this team, he said finally. I've had problems before. Not like these men. I've worked with special operations before. Rangers, Walker said. One in bed with 1st SFODD during a low-intensity operation in the Horn of Africa. I read your jacket. That's not the same as this. With respect, sir, the distance between a target and a bullet doesn't change based on which unit I'm attached to. Walker didn't smile, but something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, something that wasn't quite acknowledgement, but was adjacent to it. The men aren't going to accept you easily, he said. I don't need to be accepted, Claire said. I need to be positioned correctly. Walker looked at her for a long moment. Then he closed the folder. Briefing at 1400, he said, don't be late, Marna. The briefing room held 12 people, and the air inside it was the kind of thick that happens when a lot of large, physically confident men are in a small space together. Claire found a seat near the back. Kowalski sat down next to Miller 3 rows ahead of her, and she saw Kowalski lean over and say something that made Miller snort. She didn't need to hear it. She'd already heard enough. Walker came in at exactly 400, and the room went quiet, the way rooms go quiet when a certain kind of person enters them. Not out of fear exactly, but out of something that recognized authority, the way animals recognize a predator. All right, Walker said, pulling up the tactical display. Here's the situation. The display showed a satellite image of a remote stretch of desert terrain in southern New Mexico near the border, where the land became a maze of arroyos and volcanic rock formations and mountain ridges that looked on a topographical map like a tangled fist. High-value target, Walker said. Enemy commander operating a coordinated insurgent network out of a compound here. He tapped a point on the map. Intelligence has the target present at the compound for a 48-hour window starting tomorrow night. Our window for extraction is narrow. We go in, we take the target, we get out before sunrise. And outlined the approach, 2 vehicles to a staging point, 12 kilometers from the compound. Then a 6-kilometer foot movement through a canyon system that cut through the mountain range and came out approximately 800 meters from the compound's south wall. Claire looked at the map. She looked at the canyon. She looked at the ridge lines above the canyon, and something cold settled in her stomach. She raised her hand. Walker's eyes found her in the back of the room. The other operators turned to look. Nobody said anything, but she could feel the weight of their skepticism pressing against her like a physical force. Bennett, sir, the canyon approach concerns me. It's the most direct route. It's also a natural choke point, Claire said. She stood up, moved to the display, and pointed at the ridgelines on either side of the canyon. These elevated positions here and here provide complete line of sight into the canyon floor for approximately 4 kilometers. If the target's security element has any forward reconnaissance, which they know that canyon is the most likely approach vector, they'll have observation posts on these ridges, possibly more. The room was quiet. Walker watched her. Furthermore, Claire continued, the intelligence report mentions a storm system moving through the region tomorrow night. Based on the current trajectory, that storm will make air support and communication unreliable during our extraction window. We've operated in adverse conditions before, Kowalski said from the 3rd row. Claire didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Walker. The storm combined with the terrain creates a scenario where the team can be caught in the canyon with no air cover and degraded communications and hostile forces occupying the high ground on both sides, she said. If that happens, the mission doesn't just fail. People die. The silence stretched. Then Miller said quietly enough that it was meant to be heard only by the men around him, but loud enough that Claire's trained ears caught it without difficulty. Somebody's scared. A few controlled chuckles. Walker held up one hand and the room went quiet again. Bennett, he said, what's your recommendation? The ridge to the northeast, Claire said, pointing. If I can position myself there before the team enters the canyon, I have line of sight to both the approach vector and the compound. I can provide overwatch that covers your movement and your extraction. Walker studied the map. That ridge is 900 meters above the canyon floor, he said. Yes, sir. The approach to the summit is exposed. In a storm, I can make it. The distance from that ridge to the canyon floor is nearly 3 kilometers at the deepest point. Yes, sir. Walker turned away from the display and looked at her directly. A 3-kilometer shot in desert conditions in a storm is not a realistic option, Specialist. It doesn't need to be my primary option, Claire said. It's my coverage envelope. The closer engagements are what matter. The 3-kilometer distance is the outer limit. Walker shook his head slowly. No, he said. You stay with the team. We maintain formation. We move together. Claire looked at him. She looked at the map. She looked at the ridge. Sir, that's my decision, Bennett. You stay with the team. He turned back to the display and moved on to communications protocols. And Claire returned to her seat and she sat there with the cold thing in her stomach getting colder. And she looked at the map projected on the wall and she did the math that nobody else in the room had done. If the enemy was waiting in that canyon, and her gut, which was built from years of studying how ambushes were constructed and how they failed, told her they were then a 12-person element moving through that choke point in a storm, was walking into a trap that had already been set. She sat there and looked at the map, and she made a decision that she hadn't made yet, not consciously, but that was already becoming inevitable in the quiet parts of her mind, where real decisions happen before the rest of you catches up. She was going to that ridge, whether Walker sent her or not. The team departed the staging area at 2100 hours the following evening, and the storm arrived ahead of schedule. That was the first sign. Weather systems in the desert move differently than they do in other terrain. They build fast, collapse faster, and the transition between clear sky and complete visibility loss can happen in under 20 minutes if the conditions are right. The meteorological brief had put the storm's arrival at 0100. It showed up at 2340. Claire was moving with the team through the initial approach when the sky to the west turned the color of rust. She had been watching that sky for the last 90 minutes. She had been watching something else too. Lieutenant, she said quietly, moving up beside Walker at the front of the formation. Bennett, stay in your position. Sir, the ground. She pointed her light briefly downward, sweeping it across the dirt in front of them. Those tire tracks, they're recent. Walker stopped, looked. The tracks were there, wide, heavy, the kind of tread pattern that matched military logistics vehicles or heavy tactical trucks. They cut across the approach path at an oblique angle, heading toward the northern ridgeline. Supply movement, Walker said, could be anything. It's fresh, Claire said. 6 hours, maybe less. The wind hasn't disturbed the edges. She crouched and looked closer. Multiple vehicles, at least 3, moving uphill. Bennett, if they moved heavy vehicles up to that ridge, sir, they're not supplying a forward observation post. They're supplying a weapons position. Walker looked at the tracks. He looked at the ridge. The rust-colored wall of the storm was rolling closer, and the wind had picked up to the point where the air tasted like ground-up rock. We continue the mission, Walker said. Sir, that's the last time I'm going to say it, Specialist. Fall back to your position. Claire fell back. She moved to her position in the formation third, from the rear standard overwatch spacing, and she looked at those tire tracks one more time as she passed them. 3 vehicles, moving to high ground. Before a storm, she knew what that meant. She knew it the same way she knew what a particular kind of silence in a forest meant, what a particular pattern of behavior in a human target meant, what a particular configuration of shadow and geometry meant, when you were looking through a scope at a ridgeline that was supposed to be empty. She knew it because she had spent 5 years of her life learning to read the spaces between visible things, to understand the world through the evidence it left behind when it didn't think anyone was paying attention. The enemy was up there, and the SEAL team was walking toward them. For the next 11 minutes, Claire walked in formation and said nothing and thought about every variable she could control and every variable she couldn't. She thought about Walker's face when he told her to fall back. She thought about Miller's voice when he said somebody's scared. She thought about the ridge to the northeast, the one she had pointed to in the briefing room, the one that looked on the map like the only position in this entire section of terrain from which a single shooter could cover the canyon, the approach, and the compound simultaneously. She thought about what would happen if she was wrong. She thought about what would happen if she was right. At 2,358 hours with the storm wall 50 meters away and the world dissolving into orange noise, the formation rounded a bend in the canyon and Claire stopped walking. She stood there. The formation continued forward. Miller, passing her, glanced back. "Keep up, doll." She didn't move. She looked to the northeast. The ridge was invisible in the storm. It was a ghost. It was a guess. It was 3 kilometers of vertical rock and wind and darkness, in something that required a level of physical effort that she had never quite had to produce before from a standing start with a storm already closing around her. She looked at the formation moving away from her. She looked at the ridge. She turned northeast, and she started climbing. The climb took 4 hours and 40 minutes. There was no path. There had never been a path. The ridge was not a place where human beings were supposed to go, which was precisely why it was the only position that mattered. The rock cut through her gloves in the first 20 minutes. She felt the warmth of blood on her palms in the first 30. She shifted her grip, changed her technique, and kept moving. The rifle on her back, the Barrett MRAD, which weighed 14 pounds, unloaded and closer to 18 with the scope and suppressor configuration she was running, shifted with every movement, and she had to compensate, constantly adjusting her center of gravity, using her core in ways that most people would have found impossible to sustain. She was not most people. She had trained for exactly this. Not this specifically, not this ridge, not this storm, not this collection of circumstances that had arranged themselves around her like a puzzle designed to see how much she could take before she quit. But she had trained for the principle of it, the idea that the shot you prepare for in ideal conditions is almost never the shot you actually have to take. That real work happens in the dark, in bad weather, in a body that has already given more than it had and is being asked to give more still. The wind hit 50 knots on the upper face of the ridge. She pressed against the rock and waited. She thought about Walker's voice. "No, Bennett. You stay with the team." She thought about Miller. "Somebody scared." She put her head down against the rock, and she breathed, and she waited for a lull in the gust. And when it came a 5-second window of slightly less brutal wind, she moved. 12 meters. Another gust. She pressed in, breathed, waited, moved. This is how the next 2 hours went. 12 meters, press, breathe, move. And somewhere in the middle of that, somewhere around the 2.5-hour mark, when her hands were past the point of sending clear pain signals and had moved into a kind of numb warmth that she knew from experience was either fine or very bad, she stopped thinking about Walker and Miller in the briefing room. She stopped thinking about the team. She stopped thinking about being seen or not seen, believed or not believed, respected or mocked. She thought only about the next 12 meters, and then the 12 after that, and when she finally pulled herself over the final lip of rock and lay flat on the summit of the northeast ridge, breathing in great ragged pulls, the storm was so complete around her that she couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. She lay there for exactly 3 minutes. Then she set up her rifle. The thermal scope cut it through the storm, the way a flashlight cuts through a dark room. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Heat signatures resolved out of the noise, the cool blue of rock and ground, and then the bright orange-white of living bodies. She counted them. 1, 2, 3, her breath caught. 5, 7, 9. 9 hostile signatures arranged in a pattern she recognized immediately, a deployment pattern she had seen in training materials captured from enemy units in 3 different operational theaters. It was a mortar ambush configuration. The signatures were moving into final positions. The team in the canyon below had minutes, maybe less. She grabbed her radio. "Alpha Team, this is Overwatch. I have 9 hostile signatures, mortar ambush configuration, northeast ridgeline. You are walking into a kill zone. Break contact now. I say again, static, complete static. The storm had collapsed her radio frequencies into uselessness. She tried 4 different channels. Static, 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 static. She looked through the scope. Through the thermal imaging, through 3 kilometers of storm-driven desert air, she could see the bright signature of the mortar team's senior operator lifting around toward the tube. She looked at the distance, 3,050 meters. She looked at the wind, 40 to 50 knots gusting variable direction. She looked at the elevation differential, 900 meters below her. She looked at the temperature, dropping, which meant the air was getting denser, which meant her bullet would slow more quickly than in warm conditions. She looked at the round in the scope, going into the tube. And she did the math, not with paper, not with a ballistic calculator, which she didn't have. In her head, the way she had trained to do it since the first day an instructor had looked at her across a 1,000-meter range and said, "The machine can fail. The machine will fail. You have to be the machine." She adjusted the elevation turret. She adjusted the windage. She set her natural point of aim. She regulated her breathing. She found the gap between heartbeats. She whispered something. The people who were there, which was nobody, because she was completely alone on a rock summit in a sandstorm at 3 kilometers from the nearest human being, would not have been able to hear it. But if they could have, they would have heard 2 words: not today. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle pushed back against her shoulder. The bullet left the barrel at approximately 936 meters per second. It traveled through 3 kilometers of storm, and 4 seconds later, the mortar operator collapsed. Below in the canyon, the SEAL team heard an explosion. They didn't understand a sound that shouldn't have been there. A pressure wave from a mortar round that had been dropped rather than fired a weapon that had malfunctioned in a very specific and very final way. Walker spun. Contact where is unknown. Reyes had his weapon up scanning. No muzzle flash. No, the second shot came. The enemy communications operator went down. Sniper someone on the ridge shouted in a language that was not English, and the 9-man hostile force turned from a disciplined ambush team into a collection of frightened individuals looking for something they could not find because the shot had come from a direction that was physically impossible, from a distance that was practically impossible, through conditions that were absolutely supposed to be impossible. But the shots kept coming, one after another, measured, patient, inevitable, like something that had already decided the outcome and was simply making it real. Walker stood in the canyon and listened to the world above him change, and he thought about a small woman in a briefing room pointing at a ridge on a map, and he thought about his own voice saying the words that still sat heavy in his chest. "No, Bennett, you stay with the team." And then the 9th shot came, and the canyon was silent. And Walker looked up at a ridge he couldn't see in the storm, and he said her name, not Doll, her name, Claire. And somewhere 3 kilometers away and 900 meters above him, in the eye of a storm that had tried to stop her and failed, Claire Bennett chambered the next round and scanned for threats. Because the mission wasn't over. Not yet. Not by a long way. The 9th shot still echoed somewhere in the back of Walker's skull when the armored vehicle rolled into the canyon. He heard it before he saw it, the grinding of heavy treads on rock, the mechanical growl of something large and dangerous, moving with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing the people in front of you have nowhere to run. The storm had reduced visibility to less than 10 meters. The canyon walls pressed in on both sides, and the vehicle that emerged from the orange wall of dust was not a reconnaissance unit and not a logistics truck. It had a machine gun mounted on the roof, and it was pointed directly at the SEAL team's position. "Contact front!" Reyes shouted, and the team scattered left and right against the canyon walls. But there was nowhere to go because the canyon was 40 meters wide at this point, and the vehicle sat in the middle of it like a cork in a bottle, and the machine gun was already tracking, already swinging toward the cluster of heat signatures pressed against the rock. Walker threw himself behind a boulder. He heard the first burst tear through the air above his head. Rock chips exploded against his face. "RPG!" he shouted. "Somebody get me an RPG on that." "We're pinned," Miller's voice from somewhere to the left. "I can't get the angle, I can't." Another burst, longer this time. The machine gun operator had found a rhythm, was walking the fire methodically left to right along the canyon wall. And Walker understood with the cold clarity that combat produces that in approximately 15 seconds, that rhythm was going to reach him. He pressed against the rock and thought about the ridge. He thought about Claire. And then the vehicle exploded. Not a small explosion, not a mechanical failure. The engine block detonated in a fireball that sent the machine gun assembly spinning 30 meters into the air and lit the canyon walls in orange light that punched through even the storm's density and created for approximately 4 seconds a false daylight in that narrow cut of rock. The machine gun hit the canyon floor 20 meters from Walker's position. The vehicle burned. The canyon went quiet except for the storm and the fire. Walker stood up slowly from behind the boulder. He looked at the burning vehicle. He looked at the canyon walls around him. He looked at the team all 7 operators accounted for. Shaken one man with a bleeding arm from a rock fragment, but alive. Every single one of them alive. He looked up at the ridge. He couldn't see it. The storm had swallowed everything above 200 meters. But he knew she was up there. He knew it the way you know, things that have already happened before, your brain has finished processing them in the bones in the gut, in the part of you that runs calculations faster than conscious thought. Bennett, he said quietly. Nobody heard him over the wind. He said it again anyway. Then his radio crackled the first transmission that had broken through the storm interference in over 2 hours, and the voice that came through was barely recognizable through the static, thin and distant, and coming from a direction that shouldn't have been possible. Alpha Team, this is Overwatch. Storm is shifting northwest. You have a 12-minute window for extraction. 3 additional vehicles, eastern approach, ETA 14 minutes. Move now. Walker grabbed his radio. Bennett? Bennett, respond. What is your position? Static. Then northeast ridge, summit. Walker looked at Kowalski. Kowalski looked at the ridge. That's impossible, Kowalski said. Nobody climbed that in this storm. She did, Walker said. He pressed the radio. Bennett, we're moving to extraction. Can you hold your position? A pause that lasted long enough to mean something. Then I have a problem, sir. Walker's stomach dropped. Define problem. Another pause. I've been made. The radio went dead. The storm swallowed her signal, and 3 additional hostile vehicles were 14 minutes away. Walker stood in a burning canyon with 7 men who were alive because of a woman they had mocked, a woman who was now alone on a mountain summit that nobody was supposed to be able to reach, with hostile fighters climbing toward her and a storm cutting off every line of communication. He looked at his team. He looked at the extraction coordinates. He looked at the ridge, and he made the decision that would define him for the rest of his life. We're going up, he said. Kowalski stared at him. Sir, the extraction window. I heard the window. If we miss it, those 3 vehicles cut off the only road out of this canyon. We'll be trapped. Then we better move fast, Walker said. Miller, Webb on me. Reyes, take the rest of the team and start toward extraction. You reach the helicopter, you tell them to hold. You tell them we have a man on the ridge. A man, Miller repeated. Walker looked at him. A soldier. Walker corrected himself. Tell them we have a soldier on the ridge, and we don't leave without her. Miller held his gaze for a moment. Something moved in his face, something complicated, something that had to do with the 9 shots they had all just listened to, and the burning vehicle, and the fact that every one of them was breathing air. They shouldn't have been breathing anymore. Yes, sir, Miller said. And they started climbing. It was Aero 147 hours. The storm was not getting weaker, and somewhere above them, Claire Bennett was fighting a battle that nobody knew about yet. 8:01:22 hours, 35 minutes earlier, the first hostile fighter had appeared at the eastern face of the summit. Claire heard him before she saw him. The scrape of boot on rock, the displaced pebble that skittered down the face and pinged off the ledge below her position. She had already broken down the Barrett and secured it to her pack. At summit range within 50 meters, the precision rifle was not the tool she needed. She drew her sidearm. She moved to the eastern lip of the summit. The fighter was good. She would acknowledge that. He moved with the kind of controlled patience that separated trained soldiers from amateurs, and he had chosen a line up the eastern face that took advantage of every shadow and every fold in the rock. In clear weather with good visibility, she might have missed him until he was 20 meters away. But she had set her thermal monocular on a small rock outcropping to her right, scanning a 60-degree arc across the eastern approach. She saw his heat signature at 90 meters, then another. Then a third. 3 fighters, eastern approach. moving in a standard three-point climbing formation, one advancing, two covering rotating positions to maintain continuous coverage. It was a technique designed to make a defensive position untenable because as soon as you engaged one, the other two had your muzzle flash. Claire watched them for 45 seconds without moving. She counted their rotation intervals. She measured the gap between position changes. She identified the lead climber. Then she opened the pack she had prepared before the main shooting engagement, the pack that Walker had never seen, that nobody on the team had inventoried, because nobody had taken her preparations seriously enough to look at what she actually brought to this mountain. 3 M67 fragmentation grenades, 1 M18 smoke, 40 meters of 550 cord, and a detonator assembly that she had rigged before she ever took the first shot. Because she had known, from the moment she made the first shot and felt the rifle kick against her shoulder, she had known that the muzzle blast would generate a thermal signature that the enemy's optical equipment would detect within minutes. She had known that fighters would be dispatched to the summit. She had prepared for it, not because she was hoping to survive alone, but because preparation is what separates the people who make it from the ones who don't, and Claire Bennett had never once confused hope with planning. She began rigging the 550 cord along the eastern approach, threading it through rock channels that she had identified during her first 15 minutes on the summit before she ever looked through the scope. 3 anchor points, 2 trigger positions, 1 primary detonation node. The lead climber was 60 meters below her now. She could hear his breathing in the occasional wind lull. She finished the rig. She moved to her firing position, and she waited. The lead climber came over the rock ledge at the summit's eastern approach at 19 hours, and he was not what Claire expected, in the specific way that soldiers in the field never quite match the abstract concept of enemy you carry in your head during training. I was young, maybe 22, moving with the kind of focused intensity that she recognized as controlled fear, the expression of someone who had been told there was a sniper at the summit and was climbing toward them anyway, because the order had been given and the order would be followed. He pulled himself over the ledge and stood at the eastern edge of the summit. He looked across the flat rock. He saw her. She was standing in the open, not hiding, not pressed against a rock, standing in the open in the middle of the summit, 14 meters away with her sidearm pointed at him. He froze. People always froze. Not out of cowardice, out of the shock of finding something in a place where the mind has already decided nothing will be. His mind had built a picture of what he would find at this summit: a reinforced sniper position, multiple shooters, heavy equipment. The briefing he had received had described a coordinated overwatch unit. What he found was one woman, one small woman, 14 meters away. He hesitated. Claire activated the detonator. The 550 cord snapped taut along the eastern approach. In the 3 M67s, rigged in a linear sequence with 10-meter spacing, detonated in a rolling pattern that walked directly up the face of the mountain. The concussive wave hit the summit like a wall. Claire had already thrown herself flat. The lead fighter at the summit edge had nowhere to throw himself. The blast picked him up and deposited him somewhere below the summit that she could not see. And when Claire came back up, ears ringing, the thermal monocular showed no heat signatures on the eastern approach. She stood. She looked at her hands. They were shaking. Not from fear, from the adrenaline dump that comes after a body has done something it wasn't designed to do and got away with it. The chemical receipt that the nervous system issues when it realizes the threat has passed and it's allowed to feel the cost. She allowed herself 10 seconds. 10 seconds of shaking hands and burning ears, and the particular silence that exists inside a very loud storm when your hearing has been temporarily reduced to a high-pitched tone. Then she picked up the thermal monocular, scanned the northern approach, scanned the western face, scanned south, and found a problem. 4 more heat signatures. Northern approach, moving faster than the first 3. They weren't using a climbing formation. They were using a sprint technique, moving in short bounds, covering ground quickly at the cost of concealment, which meant someone had made a decision to accept losses and get to the summit by speed rather than stealth. 4 fighters, moving fast, 2 minutes from the summit. And Claire Bennett had no grenades left. She keyed her radio. Alpha Team Overwatch, I have 4 additional hostiles, northern approach, 2 minutes from my position. I am out of area denial munitions. Radio check, does anyone copy by bump on static? She tried again. Static. She looked at the northern approach. She looked at her sidearm. She looked at the Barrett broken down and stowed in the pack. She started pulling the Barrett out. At 15 meters, a precision sniper rifle is the wrong tool. At 2 meters, it's a club. But at 30 meters, at the distance between the northern lip of the summit and her current position, it was the right tool again if she could set it up fast enough, if she could get the scope on the approach before the first fighter crested the summit. Her hands moved through the assembly without conscious thought. Years of darkness drills, assembly by touch, eyes closed, timed against a stopwatch that didn't care about excuses, had built a motor pattern so deep it ran independently of the rest of her brain. Stock locked, barrel seated, scope mounted, bipod deployed. She was down on the rifle before the first fighter's head appeared at the northern lip. She had no time for calculations, no time for windage and elevation and bullet drop and all the careful mathematics of a precision engagement at distance. This was not that. This was 30 meters and a moving target, and the understanding that if she missed the first shot, she would not have time for a second before they were on top of her. She fired. The first fighter dropped. The second came over the lip immediately behind him. They had been moving in a chain, not a spaced formation, which told her the person leading this group was aggressive and reckless, and willing to sacrifice the first man to find out where the gun was. She cycled the bolt, fired. The second fighter dropped. But the third was already over the lip, and he was not running toward her. He was moving laterally, cutting left, which was tactically smart because it forced her to swing the rifle, which took time, and the fourth man was using that time to cut right. They were splitting her. She made a choice. Left. She swung left, found the third fighter at 20 meters, fired, and felt the rifle ripped from her hands. The fourth fighter had reached her from the right in the time it took to swing left and fire. He hit the rifle barrel with a downward strike, the kind of disarming technique that works against a bipod-mounted long gun, when you approach from the dead angle and the Barrett spun away across the rock. And then he was on her. He was larger than her by a factor that would have looked absurd if anyone had been watching 6 feet, well over 200 pounds momentum, from a running approach across the summit, all of it aimed at a woman who was 4 feet 9 and already on the ground. He expected it to be fast. It was not fast. Claire was not a sniper who had learned basic combatives because the Army made her. Claire was a woman who had spent 27 years being the smallest person in every room she had ever entered, and who had learned at 16 years old in a gym in rural Kentucky from a retired Marine who weighed 140 pounds and could take apart people 3 times his size. That size is leverage, and leverage is geometry, and geometry does not care how tall you are. She let him reach her. She used his momentum. She put him on the ground. And then she was on top of him, and the fight lasted 11 more seconds, and at the end of those 11 seconds, she stood up and the fourth fighter did not. She stood there on the summit of the northeast ridge. 4 enemy fighters down, Barrett somewhere to her right, hopefully undamaged, radio still dead, hands still shaking more than before now, the adrenaline doubled and then doubled again, the body's accounting system running far behind the actual events. She found the Barrett. She checked it. The scope had cracked where it hit the rock. She was effectively blind beyond 300 meters. She sat down, not because she wanted to, because her legs made the decision without consulting her, and she found herself sitting on the summit of this impossible mountain, in the middle of a storm that had tried to kill her 4 different ways in the last 6 hours, and she was bleeding from both hands and her left ear, and possibly somewhere on her back that she couldn't see, and the radio was dead, and the team was somewhere below her, and she did not know if they were alive. She sat there. And for the first time since she stepped off that transport helicopter and heard Jason Walker's voice say the words that had been chasing her for the last 2 days, she felt something she was not proud of feeling. She felt like maybe they had been right. Not right about her shooting, not right about her capability, but right about the fundamental premise that she was here alone, injured on a mountain nobody could reach, with no communication and a broken scope, and the knowledge that 3 enemy vehicles were on their way up the canyon, and Walker and his team were somewhere between her and extraction, and she had no way to know if they were safe or if the information she had given them, 12 minutes Eastern approach, move now, had been enough. She had done everything she could do. She had hit 9 targets from 3 kilometers in a sandstorm with a cracked scope and a broken radio in hands that didn't want to stop shaking. She had bought them time, but she did not know if the time had been enough. And that not knowing was a different kind of weight than anything the mountain had put on her. She sat with it. She looked at the dead radio. She looked at the storm. She looked at her hands. Then she heard something. Below, north face, not the sound of fighters climbing. Something else. Voices. American voices. She moved to the northern lip and looked down. Through the storm, 70 meters below, 3 heat signatures were moving up the face. Moving fast. Moving with purpose. She looked at the thermal monocular. She looked at the movement patterns. Military, American movement discipline. Fire and move bounding techniques taught at exactly one school in the United States, the school that produced the most elite tactical operators in the world. She pressed her radio one more time. Alpha team, this is Overwatch. Northern face, identify. A burst of static, then through the static, a voice that was not Walker's. Miller's voice. Derek Miller. The man who had said somebody's scared in a briefing room 2 days ago in a tone that made the word sound like something you scraped off your boot. Overwatch, this is Alpha. We see you. Hold your position. We're coming up. Claire sat back from the ledge. She pressed her back against the rock. She looked at the sky, or where the sky would have been if the storm had left any sky behind. She breathed. In, out, in, out. Copy, she said, and she waited. It took Walker and Miller and Webb another 40 minutes to reach the summit. The northern face was brutal, loose rock limited, handholds the storm pressing against them, with the sustained malice of something that had been irritated long enough to make it personal. Webb went down twice on the lower section, caught himself both times, kept moving. Miller's gloves were shredded by the time he reached the upper third. Walker didn't stop. He said nothing that they could hear over the wind. He just moved. When Walker pulled himself over the summit lip and stood up and saw her sitting against the rock, hands wrapped in torn strips of her uniform, buried across her knees, 4 hostile fighters down in various positions around the summit. He stood there for a long moment. He looked at the summit. He looked at her. He looked at the fighters. He looked at the cracked scope on the Barrett. He looked at her hands. He said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then Miller came over the lip and stood beside him. Miller looked at the same things Walker was looking at. The summit, the fighters, the cracked scope, the hands. And Miller, who had said, somebody's scared, who had called her doll every day for 2 days with a tone like a door being shut. Miller sat down on the rock next to Claire Bennett without asking permission and looked at her hands and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, let me see those. Claire looked at him. Your hands, Miller said. Let me see them. She held them out. He pulled a trauma kit from his vest and started working without speaking. Cleaning the cuts, dressing the deepest ones, moving with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this many times, who had learned to treat wounds in bad conditions and not comment on how bad the wounds were. Walker crouched in front of Claire. She looked at him. He looked at her. 9, he said. 9, she confirmed. From 3 kilometers. 3,050 meters, adjusted for elevation and wind. Walker was quiet for a moment. The vehicle, he said. Moving target. I waited for the engine bay to come into my sight line. In a 50-knot crosswind. 47, she said. It had dropped slightly by the time I took that shot. Walker looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who is processing something that doesn't fit inside the categories he has spent his life building. Then he said, I left you up here. You ordered me to stay with the team, Claire said. I didn't stay. I know you didn't. He paused. If you had, don't, she said. He stopped. Don't do the math on that, she said. It doesn't help anything. Walker looked at his hands. Then he looked back up at her. I owe you an apology, he said, for more than tonight. You owe me an extraction, Claire said. We can do the rest later. Something moved in Walker's face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. 3 vehicles, Eastern Canyon approach, he said. Reyes has the team at the helicopter. We have approximately 9 minutes. Then we should move. Yes, Walker said, we should. He stood. He reached down and offered his hand. Claire looked at his hand. She thought about the file burning in the trash can. She thought about the laughter in the briefing room. She thought about the photograph on the floor. She took his hand. He pulled her to her feet. Miller stood as well, and without saying anything, he took the Barrett from her. The rifle that weighed 18 pounds that she had carried up this mountain alone in a sandstorm, that she had used to do something that neither of them would fully process for days, and he shouldered it alongside his own weapon. I got it, he said. Claire looked at him. I got it, he said again. She let him carry it. And then the three of them, Miller and Webb, moving ahead. Walker at her side began the descent. The storm had not weakened. The mountain had not gotten smaller. The 9 minutes were already becoming 8. But they moved, because that was all there was to do. And somewhere below them, 3 enemy vehicles were moving through a canyon that was littered with the evidence of what one small soldier had done from an impossible distance in an impossible storm. And the helicopter was waiting, and the people inside it were alive. The descent was nothing like the climb. Going up, Claire had been alone, and alone meant she could set her own pace, make her own decisions, stop when she needed to stop, and move when the wind allowed it. Going down with 3 men who were not injured and not exhausted and not running on the last reserves of something that had stopped being adrenaline 2 hours ago and was now just pure stubbornness. That was a different kind of hard. Walker stayed at her left shoulder the entire way down. He didn't offer his hand again. He didn't hover. He simply positioned himself where if she slipped, he would be the thing between her and the rock face below, and he stayed there without making a production of it, without saying anything about it, as if it were simply the most logical place for him to be. She noticed. She didn't say anything either. The wind was still hitting 40 knots on the upper face, and the rock was slick in the places where the storm had driven moisture into the crevices, and Miller was ahead of them, carrying the Barrett across his back alongside his own weapon. And every time Claire's boot found uncertain ground, Walker's hand came out, not grabbing just present available, and then withdrew when she had her footing. It happened 4 times on the upper section. The 5th time, her left boot slipped on a wet ledge and she went sideways, and Walker caught her by the arm with a grip that was immediate and solid and entirely without drama, and held her until she found the next hold. I'm fine, she said. I know, he said. He released her arm. They kept moving. At 0231 hours, with 6 minutes remaining in the extraction window, they came off the lower face of the ridge and hit the canyon floor running. Running was generous. Claire's legs had decided somewhere around the midpoint of the descent that they had fulfilled their contractual obligations for the evening and were now operating on reduced capacity. What she was doing was a controlled forward fall, each stride catching her before she went all the way down, momentum substituting for the muscle power that had been spent somewhere on a rock face in a sandstorm 3 hours ago. Walker matched her pace. Webb and Miller pulled ahead, moving toward the extraction point at a speed that put them in a different category, entirely the category of people who had not just spent 5 hours climbing a mountain alone. How far? Claire asked. 800 meters, Walker said. Canyon opens up at 400. Helicopter is in the flat ground beyond. The vehicles. Reyes called them in at the mouth of the canyon 6 minutes ago. They stopped. Why did they stop? Walker was quiet for a moment. Reyes had the team set up a blocking position at the canyon mouth. When the lead vehicle came around the bend and the driver saw 7 SEAL operators with heavy weapons in a prepared position. Walker paused. They stopped. Claire processed that. They were waiting for their summit team to report in, she said. That would be my read. Their summit team isn't going to report in. No, Walker said. They are not. They ran another 200 meters in silence, the kind of silence that exists between people who have just been through something together and haven't yet figured out what language to use for it. Then Claire said, the file. Walker didn't answer immediately. You burned my file, she said, the personnel record. Walker kept running. I saw the ash in the trash can when I came in for the briefing, Claire said. I didn't say anything because it didn't matter. But I want you to know I saw it. Walker ran 3 more strides. Then, it was a mistake. Yes, Ed, it was. There's nothing I can say about it. I'm not asking you to say anything about it, Claire said. I'm telling you I know, that's all. Walker nodded once, the kind of nod that means understood, and also means more than that, means I will carry. This means this is not something I'm going to excuse myself from with an apology. They kept running. At the 400-meter mark, the canyon walls fell away, and the ground opened into the flat expanse beyond, and Claire could hear the helicopter before she could see it, the distinctive thrum of rotors fighting the storm to hold a hover, the sound of a machine working hard to be somewhere the wind didn't want it to be. Reyes met them at the canyon mouth. He looked at Walker first, then at Claire. He ran his eyes over her, the wrapped hands, the blood on her uniform jacket from the ear that had stopped bleeding, but not before it had made a mess, the general condition of someone who had been doing things to themselves that the human body files under the category of formal complaints. Overwatch, he said. It was not her name, and it was not the nickname. It was something else, the call sign she had earned, the designation that belonged to the position she had taken and held when nobody believed she could reach it. Reyes, she said. We counted 9, he said, before the vehicle. 9, she confirmed. Reyes looked at her for a moment in a way that was not the way he had looked at her in the briefing room, not the way any of them had looked at her for the last 2 days. Then he turned and led them toward the helicopter. The team was assembled at the bird of 7 operators, all present, one with a pressure bandage on his forearm, where the rock fragment had opened a gash that would need stitches but wasn't going to threaten anything important. They were loading gear, securing weapons, doing the mechanical work of an extraction in the focused way that training takes over when conscious thought is busy elsewhere. And then Kowalski saw her. Senior Chief Petty Officer Raymond Kowalski, who had stood at the fuel depot and said that little girl's going to get somebody killed, who had used the word doll the way you'd use a word that means worthless, that means out of place, that means you don't belong here, and I'm going to keep reminding you of it. He saw Claire come around the nose of the helicopter. He stopped what he was doing. He stood there with a weapons case in both hands, and he looked at her, and the expression on his face was one that Claire had not seen before and would not have expected from him. It was not guilt exactly, because men like Kowalski did not wear guilt openly. It cost too much, and they had learned early that costs like that had to be managed carefully. But it was adjacent to guilt. It was the face of a man who had run a calculation and arrived at an answer that required him to revise a prior assumption, and the revision was not comfortable. He set the weapons case down. He walked toward her. Claire watched him come. He stopped 2 feet from her. Kowalski, she said. Senior Chief, he said. She waited. I said you'd get somebody killed, he said. I remember. I was wrong. It was 4 words. It was not an elaborate apology. It was not a speech. Raymond Kowalski was not a man who made speeches, and she would not have trusted it if he had. 4 words from a man like that cost something real, and she understood what they cost, and she accepted them for what they were. Yes, she said, you were. He picked up the weapons case. He went back to loading the helicopter, and that was that. Walker came up beside her. We need to get you to a medic. I need to get on that helicopter first. That's the same thing. Doc Ferris is on the bird. They boarded. The helicopter lifted at 0239 hours exactly at the edge of the extraction window, and as it climbed and banked north and the canyon fell away below them, Claire looked out through the open door at the terrain they were leaving, the canyon, the burning vehicle, and somewhere up in the storm, invisible now, the summit of the northeast ridge. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked away. Doc Ferris, hospital corpsman, first class. James Ferris, the team's medical support. A quiet man from Georgia who had the hands of a surgeon and the bedside manner of someone who had learned that the best thing to say to people who had been hurt was usually nothing. Unwrapped her hands and looked at them without expression. This is going to need more than field dressing, he said. I know. The ear too, I know. And something tore in your shoulder. Rotator probably. Do you feel that? Claire thought about it. She moved her right shoulder experimentally, and yes, there it was, the deep, specific ache of something that had been pushed past its structural tolerance, the kind of pain that hides during the event because the body is smart enough to know you can't stop and only presents itself when you're finally somewhere safe enough to feel it. I feel it now, she said. You'll feel it a lot more tomorrow, Ferris said. Good. Tomorrow I'll be somewhere I can afford to feel it. Ferris began working on her hands. Miller sat across from her in the hold, and he watched Ferris work for a moment, and then he looked at the Barrett where it lay across his knees, and he turned it over once, looking at the cracked scope. How did this crack? He asked. It fell, Claire said. Snipers don't drop their rifles. I didn't drop it. Someone knocked it out of my hands. Miller looked up from the scope. Claire held his gaze. Miller looked back down at the scope. He turned it over again. He was quiet for what felt like a full minute, the helicopter noise filling the space between them. Then he said, that fighter, at the summit, you took him hand to hand. Yes. He was bigger than you. Most people are. How? Leverage, Claire said, physics, and a retired Marine in Kentucky who spent 2 years teaching me that if you know where the force is going, you don't have to match it. You just redirect it. Miller looked at her. He had the expression of someone who was adding a piece to a picture that had been assembled wrong and was only now starting to show the correct image. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "Shooting." "All of it. The shooting, the climbing, the—" He stopped, started again. "How long have you been doing all of this and listening to people tell you that you can't?" The question landed differently than she expected. It wasn't combative. It wasn't rhetorical. It was the question of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, and that was rarer than the hostility and easier in some ways to handle. "Since I was 17, Claire said. First time I walked into a shooting range and the instructor told my father there was no point in teaching me because I was too small to handle the recoil." "What did you do?" "I asked if I could try anyway. And I shot better than every other person in that class on the first day." The instructor stopped saying things like that after that. Miller nodded slowly. "That's been the pattern," Claire said. "Every time, every program, every unit." She paused. "People decide what I am before I've done anything, and then I do something and they have to recalibrate. That must get exhausting." "It used to," she said. "Now it's just Tuesday." Something shifted in Miller's face. It might have been a smile. It came and went quickly the way smiles do on men who are not used to letting them stay. "For what it's worth," he said. "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't tell me what it's worth yet," Claire said. "We just got off a mountain. Give it a week. See how you feel about it when there's no adrenaline left." Miller looked at her. Then he nodded. "Fair," he said. The helicopter banked hard right, and Walker, strapped into the jump seat near the cockpit, grabbed the overhead handle and looked back into the hold. 15 minutes to base," he called. Nobody responded. The team was running on fumes, the particular silence of people who have spent everything they had and are now waiting for the place where they can finally stop moving. Claire leaned her head back against the fuselage. She closed her eyes. She thought about the summit. Not the shots she would think about, the shots later would break them down in the quiet of a debriefing room with a ballistics specialist who would look at the numbers and go very still before saying anything. She thought about the moment before the shots, the moment when she had lain flat on the summit and looked through the thermal scope and seen the 9 signatures moving into position and understood with complete clarity that she was the only thing standing between those signatures and 7 American operators who were going to die in a canyon because one man had refused to believe that the terrain analysis of someone who was 4 feet 9 inches tall was worth taking seriously. She thought about what that had felt like, not heroic, not cinematic, not the way those things look in the version people tell afterward when the outcome is known and the story has a shape. It had felt like math, like a problem with a solution, and the solution required her to do something very difficult. And the difficulty was irrelevant because the problem still needed solving. That was all. That was the entirety of it. She opened her eyes. Ferris had finished with her hands and was working on her ear. His movements precise and economical. His face the professional blank of someone who treats the wound and leaves the story to other people. Walker was watching her from the jump seat. She could feel it without looking, the particular quality of attention from a direction that doesn't announce itself. She turned her head and looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment, then he looked away first. That was new. In 2 days of working in proximity to Jason Walker, he had not once looked away first. He was the kind of man whose eye contact was a tool, something he deployed with the deliberate force of someone who understood that presence is a form of authority and eye contact is a component of presence. He had looked away first. She filed that. The helicopter touched down at 0318 hours at the base in Arizona, and the rotors were still spinning down when the ground team came out to meet them. Medical personnel, intelligence officers, the base commander, a Navy captain named Hendricks, who had the expression of someone who had been awake for 20 hours and was expecting to be awake for 20 more. They moved Claire to the medical building first. Walker walked beside her. Hendricks fell into step on her other side. "Specialist Bennett," Hendricks said, "I've been getting preliminary reports from the helicopter. I want to hear the full account." "After medical," Walker said. Hendricks looked at Walker. "She goes to medical first," Walker said. The tone was not aggressive. It was something flatter than that, something that didn't leave room for negotiation. Hendricks looked at Claire. "After medical," he agreed. The medical evaluation took 40 minutes. The shoulder was confirmed as a partial rotator cuff tear, significant requiring rest and physical therapy, potentially surgery, depending on how it responded to initial treatment. The hands would heal, the ear would heal. Doc Ferris had been right about all of it. The physician who examined her, a Navy doctor named Castillo, who had worked with special operations units long enough to stop being surprised by the condition. People came back in, looked at her overall condition when he finished the examination and said simply, "What did you do tonight?" "My job," Claire said. Castillo looked at her for a moment. "Whoever sent you out there," he said carefully, "needs to think carefully about what they ask you to do." "The man who sent me out there," Claire said, "told me to stay with the team." Castillo blinked. "I made my own call," she said. Castillo was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Get some sleep after the debrief." He left. The debrief happened in a room with a table and 6 chairs and a recording device, and Captain Hendricks and 2 intelligence officers, whose names Claire was given and immediately forgot. Walker sat at the end of the table. The rest of the team had been debriefed separately. Hendricks started at the beginning. He took her through the mission timeline, departure approach, the tire tracks, the storm, the decision to divert to the ridge. He stopped her at the ridge. "You were ordered to stay with the team," he said. "Yes, sir." "And you disobeyed that order?" "Yes, sir." The room was very quiet. "Walk me through your reasoning," Hendricks said. Claire walked him through it. The terrain analysis, the tire tracks, the storm timeline, the tactical mathematics of 9 hostile fighters with a mortar team in a superior elevated position versus 7 operators in a canyon with no air cover and degraded communications. The calculation that the only intervention that could change the outcome was a long-range overwatch position on the northeast ridge. Hendricks listened without interrupting. The intelligence officers took notes. Walker said nothing. When she finished, Hendricks was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You climbed that ridge alone in the storm with a 14-pound precision rifle on your back. 18 pounds with the scope configuration," Claire said. "And you reached the summit." "Yes, sir." "And you made 9 confirmed kills from," Hendricks checked the paper in front of him, 3,050 meters. "Yes, sir." "In a 50-knot sandstorm. 47 knots at the time of the initial engagement. Wind speed varied during the engagement sequence." Hendricks put the paper down. He looked at Walker. Walker met his gaze and said nothing. Hendricks looked back at Claire. "The disobedience of the order," he said. "That's a problem I have to address. You understand that?" "Yes, sir." "However," he paused, "the outcome of that disobedience is 7 SEAL operators who are alive right now and would not be otherwise." He paused again. "That creates a complicated situation." "I understand, sir." "No disciplinary action will be recommended," Hendricks said. He said it carefully, like a man placing something fragile on a surface. "The record will reflect that you exercise independent tactical judgment in a situation where communication with command had been lost." He looked at her steadily. "That's the accurate description of what happened." "Yes, sir," Claire said. "It is." Hendricks nodded once. Then he picked up his folder and stood. "Get some rest, Specialist," he said. He left. The intelligence officers followed him. The room was empty except for Claire and Walker. Walker sat at the end of the table and didn't move. Claire sat at her end and didn't move either. The recording device was off. The door was closed. After a long moment, Walker said, "I'm going to correct the mission record personally." "That's not necessary." "It is." He looked at the table between them. "The current mission record shows this operation as a standard SEAL direct action mission with sniper support. That's not what this was." He looked up. "This was a mission that failed tactically at the command level and succeeded because one person made a better decision than the commander did." He held her gaze. "That needs to be on the record, not buried." Claire looked at him. "If you correct it that way," she said, "it reflects on your command." "Yes," Walker said, "it does. That could affect your career." "Yes," he said again, "it could." She studied him. "Why?" she said. Walker was quiet for a moment. "Because I burned your file," he said. "Because I stood in a briefing room and let my team humiliate you and said nothing. Because I told you to stay with the team when you were right and I was wrong." He paused. "And because 7 men are alive tonight because you didn't listen to me, and if the record doesn't say that, it's a lie. And I won't build a career on a lie about what happened on a mountain in New Mexico." Claire looked at him for a long time. She thought about the photograph on the floor, the ash in the trash can, the laughter in the briefing room, the words that had followed her across the tarmac and through the canyon and up the mountain. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. He stood. He was moving toward the door when she said, "Walker." He stopped. "The men," she said. "Whatever you put in the record, I don't need it to be a corrective for the men. I don't need them to read something that makes them feel like they owe me something official." She paused. "What happened on that mountain is what happened. That's enough." Walker turned and looked at her. "Is it?" he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he nodded. "Good night, Specialist Bennett," he said. "Good night, sir," she said. He left. Claire sat alone in the empty debrief room and listened to the sound of the bass settling around her generators. Distant voices, the mechanical noises of a military installation in the hour before dawn. Sounds she had been falling asleep to for 5 years in bases that all smelled slightly different, but all sounded more or less the same. She looked at her wrapped hands. She flexed them, carefully testing the limits of the dressing, feeling the specific pull of the cuts that Ferris had closed. Somewhere in this base, 7 men were in various states of processing what had happened in a canyon in New Mexico. 7 men who had gone to sleep 2 nights ago, believing a certain set of things about themselves and about the people who were capable of standing beside them, and who were now awake in the early hours of morning, trying to figure out what they believed instead. She didn't envy them that. It was uncomfortable recalibrating. She knew it from the other side, from the years of being the one who was recalibrated, around who stood at the center of someone else's revision and waited while they caught up. It was not comfortable. It required something of people that not everyone was capable of giving. She would wait and see which of them could give it. That was tomorrow's problem. Tonight she had done what she came to do. 9 targets, 3,050 meters. A storm that tried to make it impossible. A mountain that tried to make it impossible. A command structure that had tried before any of it to make it impossible. All of it had tried. None of it had succeeded. She stood up. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the handle. And then she stopped because the thought arrived fully formed the way some thoughts do, without warning, without the usual process of construction. It was just there, complete. In the briefing room 2 days ago, Walker had burned her file, every qualification score, every confirmed kill, every documented achievement, gone. But you could burn a file. You could not burn what she had done on that mountain. That was already part of the record in a way that no match and no trash can could touch. That was hers. She opened the door. She walked out into the early morning air. And behind her in the empty debrief room, the recording device sat on the table with its indicator light, dark, and the only sound was the ventilation system cycling through its sequence. And then that sound faded too, and the room was quiet, and the story of what had happened on the northeast ridge in a New Mexico sandstorm was already becoming something larger than a room, larger than a base, larger than the 7 men who were alive because of it. It was becoming something that traveled, the way certain stories do, the ones that need to be told. She slept 4 hours. Not because 4 hours was enough. Her body was making it abundantly clear that 4 hours was not enough, that the shoulder alone was going to demand a reckoning, that 4 hours of sleep had done precisely nothing to prepare her for. But at low 700, someone knocked on the door of the medical quarters where Doc Ferris had installed her after the debrief, and the knock had the particular quality of official business, the kind that doesn't go away if you ignore it. "Bennett," it was Ferris's voice. "Captain Hendricks wants you at 0800, main briefing room." Claire lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling. "Copy," she said. She got up. The shoulder informed her in language that left no room for misinterpretation exactly how it felt about that decision. She moved through it. She had learned at 17 in a gym in Kentucky that pain was information, and information was useful. And useful things deserved acknowledgement but not surrender. She acknowledged it. She got dressed. At 0748, she walked into the base cafeteria to get coffee, and the room did something she did not expect. It went quiet. Not the hostile quiet of 2 days ago, when she had walked through spaces and felt the silence close behind her like a door being shut. This was a different kind of quiet, the kind that happens when a room full of people registers that someone significant has entered, and the registering takes a moment, and the moment requires silence. There were 14 people in that cafeteria. 3 of them were from Walker's team, The others were base personnel, logistics, staff communications, technicians, ground support crew. People who had spent the night in the operations center, monitoring a mission that had gone sideways in a sandstorm, and then somehow hadn't. Every one of them looked at her. Claire walked to the coffee station. She poured coffee. She turned around. At a table near the window, Kowalski sat with Reyes and a communications technician. She didn't recognize. Kowalski met her eyes. He didn't nod. Kowalski was not a nodding man, but something passed across his face that functioned as acknowledgement, as the nonverbal equivalent of "I see you." And this time the scene carried weight. She carried her coffee to a table and sat alone. She was halfway through the cup when Miller sat down across from her. I didn't ask. He just sat the way people who have been through something together sometimes simply occupy the same space without requiring an invitation because the invitation was already issued somewhere on a mountain in the dark. He had a tray, eggs, toast, coffee. He ate for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "You sleep. 4 hours." "Same." He pushed the eggs around his tray. "I keep thinking about the summit." "Don't," she said, "hard not to." "I know. But the math on what almost happened is a hole you can fall into and not come back out of. It's not useful." Miller looked at her. "How do you do that?" "Do what?" "Shut it off, the what-ifs." He set his fork down. "I've been in combat for 11 years. I've lost people. I've been in situations that should have gone differently. And I still run the what-ifs. I'm running them right now." He paused. "How do you just not?" Claire looked at her coffee. "I don't not," she said. "I run them at a scheduled time, 0200 when I can't sleep anyway. I give them 1 hour. I look at every decision I made, every alternative path, every place where one different choice leads to a different outcome. I do it systematically, and then I close it." She looked up at him. "If you let the what-ifs run on their own schedule, they run all the time. If you put them on your schedule, they run when you decide." Miller was quiet for a moment. 1 hour, he said. 1 hour, and then you close it. No extensions." He nodded slowly. He picked up his fork again. They ate in the silence for a moment, and the cafeteria noise filled in round them. Conversations resuming trays, moving the ordinary sounds of a military base that had survived a bad night and was moving into a new day. "The file," Miller said. Claire looked at him. "I didn't know he burned it," Miller said. "I want you to know that. Whatever else I said, whatever else I didn't know about the file." "It doesn't matter now. It matters to me." He met her eyes. "What he did with that file, that's not how I operate. I want that on the record. Between us." Claire studied him. Derek Miller had the face of a man who was saying something true. She had learned to read faces the same way she had learned to read terrain, through the understanding that the surface tells you something real, that you had to know what you were looking for, that the difference between a lie and a truth lived in the small muscles around the eyes and the specific quality of stillness a person had when they were telling you something that cost them. Miller was telling her something that cost him. "On the record," she said. He nodded. "Between us," she said. He nodded again. "All right," she said. He finished his eggs. 80800, sharp, the main briefing room, held a different collection of people than it had 48 hours earlier. Captain Hendricks sat at the head of the table. Walker sat to his left. The 7 SEAL operators were ranged along one side of the table, and across from them, alone on her side, except for an empty chair at the far end that nobody had taken, sat Claire. Hendricks looked at the room. "Before I begin," he said, "I want to acknowledge that this team survived a situation last night that by any reasonable operational analysis should have gone differently." He paused. "The intelligence assessment underestimated enemy preparation. The terrain analysis in the mission brief was incomplete, and the weather deteriorated faster than the forecast indicated." He looked at Walker. "Those are institutional failures that will be addressed through proper channels. What I want to address this morning is what happened given those failures." He picked up a document from the folder in front of him. "The preliminary mission report," he said. "Documents 9 confirmed hostile eliminations over a period of approximately 40 minutes from a position at 3,050 meters, elevation differential and wind conditions averaging 47 knots during a Class 3 sandstorm." He set the document down. "Those numbers represent something that, when I read them at 0400 this morning, I asked my intelligence officer to verify. Twice." He looked at Claire. He verified them both times. The room was very quiet. Specialist Bennett, Hendricks said. The record will reflect commendation for independent tactical judgment under circumstances of command isolation. A formal recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross is being drafted as of this morning. Claire did not move. The Distinguished Service Cross was the second highest military decoration the United States Army could award. The highest was the Medal of Honor. Sir, she said carefully. It will go through proper review, Hendricks said. I'm telling you now, so you're not blindsided by the paperwork. He looked around the room. I'm also telling everyone else in this room now, so there's no ambiguity about how this command views what happened last night. He closed the folder. Walker, he said. Walker straightened. The mission record correction you submitted at 0530 this morning, Hendricks said. I've reviewed it. The room did not know about the mission record correction. Claire could see it in the way the operator shifted the small, physical adjustment that happens when information arrives that recontextualizes something. It stands, Hendricks said, as submitted. Walker nodded once. Kowalski across the table looked at Walker, then at Claire. He put it together quickly. Kowalski was many things, and slow was not one of them. And his expression did the thing it had done in the cafeteria, the thing that was not quite a nod but functioned as one. Hendricks stood. Dismissed, he said. Bennett, stay. The room emptied. Walker was the last operator out. At the door he paused and looked back at Claire, and she held his gaze, and he left. Hendricks sat back down across from her. How's the shoulder, he said. Functional. Castillo says you need 6 weeks minimum before any strenuous activity. I've heard that. And what do you think about that? I think 6 weeks is 6 weeks, she said. Hendricks looked at her for a moment. Where do you want to go next? The question surprised her. Not because it was unexpected from a career standpoint at her level with a record assignment preferences carried real weight, but because of the way he asked it, like she had a choice, like the choice was genuinely hers. I want to stay mission capable, she said, whatever that requires. That requires 6 weeks of recovery. Then 6 weeks. Hendricks nodded. There's something else, he said. He picked up a second folder thinner than the first. This came in from Washington at 0600. Before I tell you what it is, I want you to know that you are not obligated to respond to it, and your response or non-response will have no bearing on your service record. Claire looked at the folder. A request, Hendricks said, from the Special Operations Command Training Center. They want you to come in as a guest instructor for their Advanced Sniper Qualification Program. He paused. Specifically for the Long-Range Engagement Module. Specifically because the program director read your qualification scores 18 months ago and has been trying to get you in front of his students ever since. He opened the folder. He was informed of last night's preliminary numbers at 0530. He called me personally at 0545. Hendricks looked up. He was very direct about his interest. Claire looked at the folder. She thought about a training range in Fort Benning. She thought about an instructor who had looked at her father and said there was no point teaching her because she was too small for the recoil. She thought about walking up to that target at the end of the first day and showing him the grouping and the look on his face and what it had cost her to stay composed in that moment when what she wanted to do was something much less composed. She thought about what it would mean to stand in front of a classroom of students who were trying to learn what she knew. Tell him yes, she said. Hendricks closed the folder. Good, he said. He stood again, and this time it was final, the standing of a man who has finished the meeting he came to have. One more thing, he said. Claire waited. The fighter at the summit, Hendricks said. The fourth one. Hand to hand. Yes, sir. The preliminary forensic assessment puts him at 6'2", 220 pounds. That sounds right, Claire said. Hendricks looked at her for a long moment. 6 weeks specialist, he said. Rest. He left. Claire sat alone in the briefing room for the second time in 8 hours, and this time the quiet felt different than it had at 0400. At 0400, the quiet had been the quiet of aftermath of exhaustion, of a woman sitting in a room where decisions had been made about her and trying to locate herself in relation to those decisions. This quiet was something else. This was the quiet of what comes next. She sat in it for a while. Then she got up and went to find Walker. She found him at the operations center standing over a tactical display with Webb and one of the intelligence officers working through the post-mission analysis with the focused efficiency of someone who processes events by dissecting them by finding the mechanism inside every outcome and understanding how it moved. He saw her come in. He said something to Webb that dismissed him without appearing to the kind of redirection that experienced commanders do without thinking. Webb and the intelligence officer moved to another section of the room. Walker turned to face her. "The record correction," she said. "It's done, but no." "I know, Hendricks told me." She paused. "I told you it wasn't necessary." "And I told you it was," Walker said. "We're going to keep disagreeing about that. I'm not here to argue about it." "Then why are you here?" Claire looked at him. She had thought about this during the walk from the briefing room to the operations center. What she wanted to say, whether she wanted to say anything, whether the things that needed to be said between them required words at all, or whether the record correction and the debrief in the mountain had already said them more clearly than language could. But there was one thing that the record correction didn't address, that the debrief hadn't touched, that existed between them in a space that official documents couldn't reach. "The briefing," she said, "2 days ago, when I pointed at the ridge." Walker held her gaze. "You told me the shot was unrealistic," she said. 3 kilometers, you said, not a realistic option." "I know what I said." "I need you to understand why that mattered," she said. "Not the tactical error. I'm not talking about the tactics. I'm talking about the specific words." She paused, finding the precision she needed. "When you said it wasn't realistic, every man in that room heard it as confirmation of what they already believed. That I didn't understand the battlefield, that I was overreaching, that my analysis was the analysis of someone who didn't know what they were doing." She held his gaze steadily. "You didn't say I was wrong. You said the shot was unrealistic. And those are different things. But in that room with those men at that moment, they landed the same way." Walker was quiet. "I'm not asking you to apologize for the tactical call," Claire said. "You made a judgment with the information you had. I understand that. What I'm asking is for you to understand the weight of the second thing, the thing underneath the tactical call." She paused. "Because if you don't understand that second thing, the next time you have someone like me in your briefing room, you'll make the same mistake, not the tactical one, the other one." The operations center hummed around them. Systems running, data processing, the low-level mechanical conversation of a facility that never fully slept. Walker stood very still. I was the kind of man who had physical stillness as a default, who had learned to make his body into something that didn't betray his thinking while his thinking ran at speed. But this was a different kind of stillness. This was the stillness of someone who has been handed something heavy and is deciding whether they have the strength to hold it properly. "I hear you," he said. "Do you?" "Yes." He paused. "I am telling you I hear it. I'm not telling you I've fully processed it, because I haven't. But I hear it." Claire nodded. "That's enough for now," she said. She turned to leave. "Bennett," she stopped. "The instructor position," Walker said. "Hendricks told you this morning." She turned back. "How do you know about that?" "The program director called me too," Walker said. "At 0600, he wanted a commander's assessment to go alongside the request." He paused. "I told him you were the best long-range shooter I had ever seen operate in live conditions. I told him that the students in his program would be learning from someone who had just done something that most of the people in the sniper community are going to be talking about for the next 20 years. And held her gaze. "I told him yes, before I knew what Hendricks was going to tell you, before you had agreed." Claire looked at him. "You told him yes," she said. "I told him yes," Walker confirmed. She studied his face, the specific quality of a man who had done something that he knew was right without knowing it, if it would be received as overreach, who had put his assessment behind her without asking her permission, and was now waiting to find out if she would call that an imposition or a gesture. "Good," she said. Something in Walker's posture shifted, barely perceptible, the kind of release that happens in the body when a question that has been held in tension finds its answer. "Good," he said. She left. The next 3 days at the base had a quality that Claire had experienced only a handful of times in her career. The particular atmosphere of an environment that is recalibrating, that has taken in new information, and is slowly, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes gracefully, reorganizing itself around that information. It happened in small things. On the first morning she went to the range for a light assessment session, Ferris had cleared her for reduced intensity range work, shoulder, immobilized left-hand only close targets. Nothing that would stress the rotator further. When she arrived, the range was occupied by Reyes and two other operators running drills. Reyes saw her. He stopped his drill. He moved his lane marker 3 positions to the right. Without being asked, without making a thing of it, just moved over, creating space the way you make space for someone who has earned the right to it. Range is yours, he said. It was 4 words. It was everything. On the second day, Kowalski appeared at the medical quarters at 1400 with a problem. He knocked. She opened the door. He stood there with the look of a man who has come to ask for something and is annoyed at himself for needing to ask. Bennett, he said, Senior Chief. I have a shooter on my team, he said. Junior guy, Rodriguez. He's been struggling with wind correction at distance. I've worked him through the standard curriculum twice. He paused. I was wondering if you had thoughts. Claire looked at him. Kowalski met her eyes and did not look away. Come in, she said. He came in. They spent 2 hours at the table in the medical quarters with a ballistics manual and a tablet and a set of range cards from Rodriguez's last 3 qualification attempts and Kowalski's Senior Chief Petty Officer Raymond Kowalski, who had stood at a fuel depot and said that little girl's going to get somebody killed, sat across from a woman who was 4 feet 9 inches tall and took notes. Not because he was ordered to, not because protocol required it, because she knew something he needed to know, and he was smart enough to recognize the difference between pride and learning, and experienced enough to understand that the ones who can't tell the difference between those two things eventually get people killed. He took notes in a small green notebook with a mechanical pencil. He asked good questions. When they finished, he stood and picked up his notebook and looked at her for a moment. Rodriguez is going to want to know where this came from, he said. Tell him whatever you want, Claire said. I'll tell him the truth, Kowalski said. He left. On the 3rd day, Walker came to her. Not at the medical quarters, not at the briefing room. He found her at the outdoor observation deck behind the operations building, where she had taken to sitting in the late afternoon with coffee, watching the desert light change through the hours when the base quieted and the air cooled and the sky did things with color that she had no good words for. He sat down in the chair beside her without asking. She handed him her coffee. He took it, drank, handed it back. They sat like that for a while, 2 people who had not figured out yet what the correct form of this was, whether it was friendship or professional respect, or something that didn't have a category. Only the undeniable fact of shared experience in a place where both of them had been tested and neither had failed. Rodriguez came to see me, Walker said. I heard. He said Kowalski taught him something about wind correction that he's been trying to figure out for 8 months. Kowalski's a good teacher, Claire said. When he decides to be. Walker looked at her. That's a generous read. It's an accurate one. He came to me because he put Rodriguez first. That's what good commanders do. She paused. He's going to be fine. Walker was quiet for a moment. The team, he said. I want to talk about the team. What about them? They're going to be asking for you, Walker said. Not officially, not through channels, but I'm going to start getting requests. Can Bennett come on the next embed? Can we get her on the pre-deployment workup? Can we request her for the qualification cycle? He looked at her steadily. I want to know how you feel about that before it starts. Claire looked at the desert. She thought about 3 days ago stepping off a helicopter with a rifle on her back and the laughter that had followed her across the tarmac. She thought about the match, the trash can, the photograph on the floor. She thought about the ridge. She thought about Miller sitting next to her and unwrapping her hands. She thought about Reyes moving 3 lanes to the right without being asked. She thought about Kowalski in the medical quarters with his green notebook. Tell them I'm available, she said, after 6 weeks. Walker nodded. There's something else, he said. His voice had changed slightly, the minor shift in register that happens when someone is moving from one kind of conversation to another, from professional to something that doesn't have a designation in the field manual. She waited. I want to ask you something personal, he said. You can tell me it's none of my business. Ask it, she said. Walker looked at the desert for a moment. How long have you been proving yourself to rooms full of people who don't believe you, he said. The question hit differently than she expected, the same way Miller's question in the helicopter had hit differently. Not because it was new, she had been asked versions of it before in interviews and evaluations and the occasional late-night conversation with someone who had seen her work and wanted to understand the person behind it. But because of who was asking, because Jason Walker had been in the room. How had been the briefing room and the burning file and the laughter that he hadn't stopped in the order to stay with the team and every specific weight that the last 3 days had put on her. He had been all of that, and now he was sitting beside her, asking how long she had been carrying it. She thought about the answer. Since I was 17, she said, first day on a range. An instructor told my father I was too small to handle the recoil. What happened? I outshot everyone in the class, she said, including the instructor's best student. And after that, bam, after that it happened again somewhere else. And then again, and then again. She paused. Every room, every program, every assignment, different men, different words, same basic calculation. She's too small, she's too young, she doesn't look like what this is supposed to look like. She turned and looked at him directly, and every time the range or the field or the mission answered the question that the room refused to answer. Walker held her gaze. Does it ever get easier? He asked. No, she said. It gets faster. I got faster at not needing the room to believe me before I did the thing. But easier. She shook her head. You don't get easier. You get harder, and harder is not the same thing. Walker nodded. He looked at his hands. I owe you more than a corrected record, he said. You owe me a good cup of coffee, Claire said. This one's cold. Something moved in Walker's face. It came quickly and went quickly, but it was real, not the controlled expression of a commander managing a professional interaction, but the face of a human being who has been handed a moment of unexpected lightness in the middle of something heavy and doesn't quite know what to do with it. I'll get you coffee, he said. Good, she said. He stood. He was 3 steps away when she said, Walker. He stopped. The Distinguished Service Cross, she said. He turned. I know you had something to do with that too, she said. Walker was quiet for a moment. Hendricks makes his own decisions, he said. He does, Claire agreed. And men who have his respect in his ear sometimes say things that inform those decisions. She paused. I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm telling you I know. Walker looked at her. Is that a problem? He said. No, she said. It's a data point. He held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded once and went inside. Claire turned back to the desert. The light was doing something particular to the rock formations. In the middle distance, the angle was changing. The shadows were deepening and lengthening, and the colors were moving through a spectrum that went from yellow to orange to something that had no good name. Something that lived between red and brown and gold and belonged entirely to the desert in the specific hour before dark. She watched it. She thought about the instructor posting. She thought about standing in front of a classroom full of shooters who were trying to learn what she had spent 10 years learning and what she would say to them and what she would make sure they understood that the standard curriculum didn't always make clear. She thought about a 17-year-old girl, Searle, on a range in Kentucky and an instructor who said no and a target at the end of a lane with a grouping that answered the question the instructor wouldn't. She would tell them that. She would start there because that was where it started, not on a summit in a sandstorm, not with 9 shots from 3 kilometers. It started on an ordinary range, on an ordinary afternoon, with an ordinary refusal and a decision to answer it, with something that couldn't be argued with. That was where it always started, and it never really stopped starting. That was part nobody told you. The range was always there in one form or another. The room was always there. The people who had already decided were always there waiting for you to prove them right. And every time the answer was the same. You stepped up. You did the work. You let the target speak. The desert light faded. The bass sound shifted into evening register. And Specialist Claire Bennett sat with her cold coffee in the particular silence of someone who has been through something that changed the shape of the world around them and is now sitting very quietly inside the new shape, learning how it fits. It fit differently than the old one, in most ways better, in some ways harder. But it was real, and it was hers, and nobody, no match, no trash can, no briefing room, no sandstorm was going to take it back. The 6 weeks passed the way recovery always passes for people who are bad at holding still slowly, then all at once with long stretches of frustrating ordinary in between the moments that mattered. Claire ran the physical therapy the way she ran everything else, systematically on schedule, without complaint and without the performative stoicism that some soldiers use to signal toughness, which is a different thing from actual toughness and always has been. She showed up to every session. She did every repetition. When Castillo told her to stop at a certain point of resistance, she stopped at that point because pushing past the limit of what the shoulder could handle would extend the timeline, and extending the timeline was the one thing she was not willing to do. She had somewhere to be. The instructor posting at the Special Operations Command Training Center in North Carolina started in 7 weeks. She intended to be there on time and at full capacity, and that required 6 weeks of doing exactly what she was told in exactly the way she was told to do it. Rodriguez came to see her in week 2. I was 24 years old from San Antonio with the particular combination of natural talent and technical frustration that Claire recognized immediately as a shooter who had been given the mechanics without the understanding behind them. He could execute the steps. He didn't yet understand why the steps worked, which meant that when conditions changed, when something in the environment didn't match the training scenario, he lost his anchor. He knocked on her door at 1600 on a Tuesday. Senior Chief said I should come, he said. I can come back if it's a bad time. It's not a bad time, Claire said. Sit down. He sat. He had Kowalski's notes in his hand, the green notebook pages that Kowalski had apparently reproduced and given to his junior shooter, which told Claire something important about Kowalski that she filed quietly and didn't comment on. I've been working through these, Rodriguez said, setting the pages on the table. The wind correction methodology, I get the math. I can execute the math. But on the range, when the conditions are actually variable, I lose something between the calculation and the shot. What do you lose? Claire asked. Rodriguez thought about it. Not a snap answer, a real think, the kind that requires a moment of silence and a willingness to sit in uncertainty long enough to find the accurate word. Confidence, he said finally. Not in myself, in the number. I calculate the correction, and then I second guess whether I calculated it right, and the second guessing affects the shot. Claire looked at him. How long between calculation and trigger? She asked. Maybe 4 seconds, maybe 5. That's where you're losing it, she said. 4 to 5 seconds is too long. In variable conditions, 4 seconds gives the wind enough time to change on you. Your calculation was right for the moment you made it. By the time you pulled the trigger, the moment is gone. Rodriguez stared at her. So the calculation has to be faster, he said. The calculation has to become unconscious, Claire said. Right now, you're doing it consciously, gathering data, running the formula, producing a number, applying the number. That's 4 steps and it takes 4 seconds. The goal is to get it to 1 step. You see the condition, you make the correction, you fire. No gap. How long does that take to develop? It depends on how you practice, she said. If you practice the calculation, it takes years. If you practice the condition recognition, if you train your eyes and your gut to read wind before your brain has finished asking the question, it takes months. Rodriguez looked at the pages on the table. That's not in the curriculum, he said. No, Claire said. It's not. He looked up at her. Can you teach it? He said. She looked at him for a moment. I'm going to be in North Carolina in 7 weeks, she said. But between now and then, yes. Come back Thursday. Bring your range cards from the last 6 months. Rodriguez picked up his pages. He stood. At the door, he paused. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. What Senior Chief told me, he said, about the mission, about what you did. He paused, choosing his words with care. He didn't say a lot. He doesn't say a lot, but he said enough. Rodriguez looked at her with the expression of someone who is 24 years old and standing in the presence of something that is rearranging his understanding of what is possible. I just wanted to say I'm glad you were there. Claire held his gaze. So am I, she said. He left. She stood at the closed door for a moment after he was gone, and she thought about what it had cost Kowalski to tell Rodriguez enough. Kowalski, who had stood at a fuel depot and made his judgment and held it for 2 full days without wavering. Kowalski, who had come to the medical quarters with a green notebook and taken notes. Kowalski, who had apparently gone back to his junior shooter and said enough that the junior shooter came to her door with gratitude in his eyes. People are capable of more than the worst version of themselves. That was not a new thought, but it arrived freshly in this specific context with this specific evidence, and it landed differently than the abstract version of it did. She filed it. She went back to her physical therapy exercises. On week 4, something happened that nobody expected. A package arrived for Claire from the Special Operations Command Training Center in North Carolina. Not paperwork, not pre-arrival logistics or administrative materials. A physical package mailed from the personal address of a man named Colonel Dennis Farrar, who was the director of the Advanced Sniper Qualification Program that had requested her. Inside the package was a single photograph. It was a range photograph, the kind taken during official qualification events, date stamp signed on the back by the range officer. It showed a target at an indeterminate distance, and the grouping in the center of that target was the kind of grouping that people in the sniper community referred to with a specific vocabulary that communicated in technical terms, something that was closer to the vocabulary of art than science. On the back in handwriting that was precise and economical. Farrar had written, "This was the best group I ever shot. Won 200 meters ideal conditions, 20 years of practice. I'm told you beat it in a sandstorm. I want my students to know what's possible. See you in 7 weeks." Claire looked at the photograph for a long time. She thought about the range in Kentucky. She thought about the instructor. She thought about the grouping she had shown him at the end of the first day and the look on his face and what it had felt like to stand at that distance and have the target speak for her when her own voice hadn't been enough. She put the photograph in the front pocket of her tactical bag. She would bring it to North Carolina. She would show it to the students on the first day. Not to boast, not to establish hierarchy, but to show them what 20 years of practice in ideal conditions looked like, so that when she told them what was possible, beyond that, what the human system was capable of when conditions were not ideal, when the range was not 1,200 meters, when the wind was not calm and the target was not stationary, they would have a reference point. They would understand that the ceiling was higher than they thought. That was the first thing she needed them to know. In week 5, Walker called, not an official call, a personal call to her cell phone at 2100 on a Thursday. She answered. "Walker," she said. "Bennett." A pause. "How's the shoulder on schedule?" "Good." Another pause, the kind that means someone is deciding whether to say the thing they called to say or to approach it from a different angle. "I heard Rodriguez has been coming to see you." "Twice a week since week 2, she said. "Kowalski told me." "Of course he did." Walker was quiet for a moment. "Rodriguez ran a qualification set yesterday. Best scores he's ever posted." Claire said nothing. "I thought you should know," Walker said. "I appreciate that." A longer pause. "The team is putting in a request," Walker said. "Formal request through channels for you to be attached to the pre-deployment workup in month 3 after North Carolina." "I know," Claire said. "Hendricks sent me the preliminary paperwork, and I haven't responded yet." Walker was quiet. "I'm going to say yes," Claire said, "but I wanted to give it time. I didn't want to say yes while the adrenaline of what happened was still in the room. I wanted to make sure the yes was real." "Is it real?" Walker said. "Yes," she said. "It's real." She could hear in the quality of silence that followed something that was not quite relief, but was what relief looked like in a person who didn't let himself express it directly. "Good," he said. "Walker," she said. "Yeah. The night on the mountain," she said, "when you came up after me." "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," he said. "The extraction window." "I know what the extraction window was," he said. "I knew it when I started climbing. The window mattered less than the other thing." "What other thing?" He was quiet for a moment. "We don't leave our people behind," he said. "That's not a policy. That's not a protocol. It's the thing underneath all of it." He paused. "I had to decide whether I actually believed it or whether I only believed it when it was easy. When the person I was leaving behind was someone I already valued." Another pause. "Turns out I believe it either way." Claire held the phone. The statement arrived with the weight of something that had cost him not to do. He had climbed the mountain without hesitation, she knew that much, but to say, to name, to put into words that acknowledged what had been broken and what had been repaired and what the repair had required. "I know," she said. "I didn't handle this well," Walker said. "From the beginning. I want to be clear about that." "You handled the mountain well," she said, "after the fact." "Most corrections happen after the fact," she said. "The ones that happen before are called prevention, and they're rarer. The ones that happen after are called correction, and they're more common, and they still count." She paused. "They still count, Walker." Another silence. "See you in month 3, he said. "Month 3, she agreed. He hung up. She sat with the phone in her hand, and looked at the ceiling of the medical quarters, which she had been looking at for 5 weeks and had now memorized in the way you memorize things you see every morning when you wake up and every night before you close your eyes. Month 3, she could work with that. The 6 weeks ended on a Tuesday morning, and Castillo cleared her at 0900 with the specific kind of satisfaction that doctors express when a patient has done exactly what they were told and the outcome has vindicated the instruction. Full range of motion, he said, moving her arm through the assessment sequence. Strength is back to baseline. The repair held. He looked at her over the examination table. Do not do what you did on that mountain again within the next 6 months. I'll do my best, she said. That's a profoundly unsatisfying answer, Castillo said. It's an honest one. He signed the clearance. She was packed and at the airfield by 1100. The team was not supposed to be there. She had not told anyone what time her flight was, because there was no formal send-off scheduled, and she had not requested one because formal send-offs were not something she had ever been offered before, and she had not thought to want one now, but Walker was there. Ann Miller, and Reyes and Webb, and Kowalski and Rodriguez, who was not technically part of the SEAL team but had apparently decided that distinction did not apply to this specific occasion. They were standing near the airfield fence when she came out of the operations building with her bag. She stopped. She looked at them. 7 people who had, in various ways and to various degrees, been wrong about her. 7 people who had done the harder thing, not the thing they were trained for, not the thing that came easily to men of their background and disposition, but the harder thing, the recalibration, the revision, the willingness to look at what they believed and measure it against what the evidence said and update accordingly. Not all of them had gotten there the same way. Not all of them had gotten there at the same speed, but they were there, all 7 of them. Standing at an airfield fence on a Tuesday morning, Walker stepped forward first. He extended his hand. She shook it. His grip was the same as the night on the mountain, immediate and solid. Not a performance of strength, but the natural product of it. But the context was entirely different, and the difference changed the meaning of the same physical gesture into something that neither of them had words for, which was fine, because the handshake itself was the word. North Carolina, he said. North Carolina, she agreed. Month 3, he said. Month 3, she said. He stepped back. Miller came forward. He did not extend his hand. He did something that surprised her. He reached into the breast pocket of his uniform jacket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper and held it out. She took it. She unfolded it. It was a number, written in Miller's handwriting, precise military, neat on a small square of paper. 3050, that was all, just the number. She looked at it, she looked at him. In case you forget, he said. The way he said it, the specific tone, the absence of irony or condescension or any of the edge that his voice had carried in the briefing room, and on the tarmac and in the canyon made the number mean something entirely different than what numbers usually mean. It was not a record. It was not a data point. It was a reminder of what had happened, of what she had done, of what was possible at the outer limit of human capability when the circumstances demanded it. She folded the paper. She put it in her pocket, next to Farrar's photograph. I won't forget, she said. Reyes shook her hand, Webb shook her hand, Rodriguez shook her hand, and then seemed to think better of the formality of it and said Thursday in North Carolina, which was not a thing that made conventional sense, but which she understood perfectly because he was telling her he intended to keep showing up, that the twice-weekly sessions were not a product of proximity, but of something he intended to maintain across distance. Thursday in North Carolina, she said, and then Kowalski, Senior Chief Petty Officer Raymond Kowalski, who had made his judgment on a tarmac and held it and then revised it in a medical quarters with a green notebook, who had told Rodriguez enough, who had moved through the weeks since the mountain with the quiet efficiency of a man who was doing the recalibration work without making it anyone else's project. He stood in front of her. He looked at her. He said, "You're a good soldier, Bennett." It was 6 words. From Kowalski, it was a speech. "So are you, Senior Chief," she said. He nodded once. He stepped back, and Claire picked up her bag, and she walked to the aircraft, and she did not look back, because looking back was not the direction she was moving. And the direction she was moving had a trajectory that she could feel the way you feel wine direction, not by seeing it, but by the pressure of it against your face, by the small adjustments your body makes without being asked. North Carolina, the students who were waiting. The things she had to teach them that went beyond ballistics and wind correction and the technical vocabulary of long-range precision shooting. She boarded the aircraft. The flight took 3 hours and 40 minutes, and she spent most of it with her eyes closed and her thoughts in the particular organized quiet of someone who is preparing for the next thing by leaving the last thing fully behind. The Miller number sat in her pocket. The Farrar photograph sat in her bag. The shoulder felt like a shoulder again, which was not nothing. She landed in North Carolina at 15:20. Colonel Dennis Farrar was at the airfield to meet her. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, with the physical bearing of someone who had spent 40 years being very good at a very demanding thing and had not allowed the years to talk him out of either the discipline or the pride. He was 6 feet tall. He had the handshake of someone who knows the handshake matters. He looked at her for exactly the same amount of time Walker had looked at her on that first day in Arizona. Unlike Walker, Farrar smiled. "Specialist Bennett," he said. "Colonel Farrar," she said. "I've been looking forward to this for 18 months, he said. "I know," she said. "I got your photograph." Farrar looked at her. "Good grouping," she said. Farrar laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded, the laugh of a man who appreciates a line delivered well, who has been around enough serious things to recognize that the ability to be briefly unserious about the serious things is a survival skill rather than a deficiency. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you the program." They walked. He showed her the facility, the ranges, the classroom spaces, the simulation rooms, the equipment. He talked about the students 12 in the current cohort, ranging from 2 to 8 years of service, all with demonstrated aptitude and precision, marksmanship, all sent here to become something more than what they currently were. He talked about the curriculum. He talked about the gaps in the curriculum, and then he stopped talking and looked at her and said, "What do you want to add?" Claire looked at the range they were standing beside. She thought about what she had told Rodriguez. The difference between practicing the calculation and practicing the condition recognition. The gap between conscious processing and instinctive reading. The thing that the standard curriculum taught you to do with your hands and your math and didn't teach you to do with your understanding of the world the bullet was traveling through. She thought about the summit. She thought about 9 signatures through a thermal scope in a sandstorm. She thought about the moment before the first shot when the mortar operator was lifting the round toward the tube, and there was no calculator and no ballistics table and no ideal conditions, when there was only what she knew and what the situation required in the gap between them that had to be closed in less than 4 seconds. "I want to add the understanding," she said. Farrar tilted his head at Cohn. "The curriculum teaches execution," she said. "It teaches the steps, the mechanics, the math. But the thing that makes the difference, the thing that I can teach them that they can't get from a textbook, is what it feels like when the conditions are wrong and you have to shoot anyway. When the calculation doesn't hold because the world isn't cooperating. When you have to trust something deeper than the formula." She paused. "That's what I want to add." Farrar was quiet for a moment. "How do you teach that?" he said. "You put them in conditions where the formula fails," she said. "You take the crutch away. You make the environment honest. And then you watch what they reach for when the thing they have been relying on isn't there." She looked at him. "The ones who have it, the instinct, the deep reading, it surfaces when the structure falls away. The ones who don't have it, yet you can see exactly where the gap is, and then you can fill it." Farrar looked at her for a long moment. "The first day of instruction is Thursday," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll be ready." He nodded. They walked back toward the facility. At the door, Farrar paused. "Can I ask you something personal?" he said. "People keep asking me that," she said. He smiled briefly. "The mission in New Mexico, the after-action report, the real one, Walker's corrected version, came across my desk through channels I won't identify." He looked at her steadily. 9 shots, 3 kilometers, storm conditions." He paused. "When you were on that summit before the first shot, what were you thinking?" Claire considered the question. Not the diplomatic version of the answer. Not the version she would give in a formal debriefing or in an official interview or any context where the answer was partly performance. The actual answer. What had actually been in her mind in the moment before she whispered "not today" and squeezed the trigger. "I was thinking about the calculation," she said. "Wind, elevation, drop, rotation. The variables I could control and the variables I couldn't. That's all, Farrar said. For the first shot, she said. For the first shot, it was only the calculation. She paused. For the second shot, I was thinking about 7 men in a canyon who were about to die because they walked into a trap I told them about, and they didn't listen. Farrar held her gaze. For the third shot, she said. I wasn't thinking about anything. I was just shooting. Farrar was quiet for a moment. That's the thing you're going to teach them, he said. It was not a question. That's the thing I'm going to teach them, she said. He held the door. She walked in. Thursday arrived with the specific electricity of first days. The air in the classroom carrying the tension of 12 people who understood they were there because they had been selected, which meant the standard they were being held to was not the standard they had already met, and that the gap between where they were and where they needed to be was the entire point of the next several weeks. Claire walked into the classroom at 0755. 12 students stood. She looked at them. They looked at her. She saw the moment, the fraction of a second, the involuntary processing that happens when the brain encounters something that doesn't match its template. 12 faces, 12 separate versions of the calculation that every person who had ever looked at her had run. The Swedish AM was the rank, the rifle on the range card in front of them that indicated the qualification scores. They had been given access to the numbers that should have answered the question before she walked through the door. But that human perception consistently failed to prioritize over the simpler, more immediate data of what a person looked like. She let the moment breathe. She let them look. She walked to the front of the room. She reached into her bag and pulled out two things. The first was Farrar's photograph, the best grouping he had ever shot. 1,200 meters, ideal conditions, 20 years of practice. She passed it to the student in the front row and said, "Pass it around." While they passed it, she pulled out the second thing, the piece of paper Miller had given her at the airfield fence. 3050. She held it up. "The photograph you're looking at," she said, "is the best shot a man with 40 years of experience ever fired, in ideal conditions, at 1,200 meters. She looked around the room. "The number on this paper is 3,050 meters, 47-knot crosswind, storm conditions. Moving target for the final engagement." She paused. Same human body, same basic biology, different understanding of what the body was capable of. The room was very still. "I'm going to spend the next several weeks taking apart everything you think you know about the ceiling of your own capability," she said. "I am going to put you in conditions that make the formula fail. I am going to take away the structure you're used to relying on, and I am going to watch what you reach for when it's gone." She looked at them steadily. "Some of you already have the thing I'm looking for. You don't know it yet because nobody has shown it to you in a way you can recognize. Some of you don't have it yet, but you will. And some of you," she paused, "some of you are going to spend the first 3 weeks being frustrated in ways you've never been frustrated before." A student in the third row, young early 20s, the kind of physical confidence that came from having been good at things for long enough to trust it, said, "How do we know which one we are?" Claire looked at him. "You don't," she said. "That's the first thing I need you to understand. You don't get to know in advance which category you're in. You find out by doing the work. That's true here, and it's true everywhere this job takes you." She held his gaze. The people who think they know in advance which category they're in are the most dangerous people on any team, because certainty before evidence is the thing that gets people killed. The student held her gaze. He nodded. "Good," she said. "Let's begin." She taught for 4 hours. At the end of those 4 hours, she looked at 12 faces that had traveled over the course of the morning, from the specific skepticism of people who are not sure what they've been sent to through the middle territory of genuine engagement, and into the particular expression of people who have encountered something that is reorganizing their understanding of their own work. She knew that expression. She had been producing it in rooms for 10 years. She would keep producing it because that was the job, not the shots, not the numbers, not the record at 3,050 meters in a sandstorm, which would be documented and analyzed and discussed in the community for years. The job was this room, these 12 faces, this reorganization. She dismissed them at 1,300. They filed out. The last one out paused at the door, the young one from the third row. He looked at her. "Instructor Bennett," he said, "not specialist." Instructor, I looked up your qualification scores last night, before today. And, she said, I thought they were a data entry error, he said. Claire looked at him. I know, she said. They always do. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he left. And Claire Bennett stood alone in the classroom in North Carolina, and outside the window somewhere beyond the range in the facility and the trees in the distance, the world was exactly the same size it had always been. She was the same size she had always been, 4 feet 9 inches, 27 years old, the smallest person in every room she had ever entered. And in every room she had ever entered, the room had eventually understood the same thing. That strength is not a measurement. That courage is not a size. That the distance between impossible and done is exactly the length of the decision to try. She had been proving that since she was 17 years old on a range in Kentucky in front of an instructor who said no. She would keep proving it, not because she needed to, because the rooms kept needing to hear it. And she was the one who knew how to say it in a language that rooms could not argue with. Not words, not credentials, not the corrected personnel file, or the distinguished service cross, or the mission record that Walker had rewritten at Euro 5:30 on a morning after a mountain. The language that rooms could not argue with was the only language that had ever mattered. The target, the grouping, the truth that travels at 936 meters per second and arrives before the argument does. That was her language. That had always been her language. And she spoke it better than anyone alive.